Number 18, Bolstering Lantern. This is the lowest ranked item in this video, but I want to be clear, that doesn't mean it's bad, it's just the worst good item. It's kind of crazy how far we've come since August. Originally, this gave you 20% bonus damage while under 50% health, which was both boring and also unhelpful, because if I'm below half health, I don't need a lantern, I need a will. Now, it gives 10% attack speed for every ally or enemy within 20 meters, up to 3, and that's fine. It's more flexible, but it's still a little bit awkward. Attack speed as a stat is alright, but it's not amazing. The 20 meter radius is the real issue here. It sounds like a lot, but it kind of isn't. You'll find yourself just barely outside of it pretty frequently, especially if you're playing a ranged survivor, or trying to survive past stage 4, where you naturally tend to keep more distance from the enemies. There are a few tricks. Drones do count, so if you buy a bunch of drones, you can maintain the buff even while playing safe. You can also get it to activate during the Mithrix fight this way, which is cool, but it can also feel like more of a dependency than a synergy. In phases 1 and 2 of the rework, stacking this would increase range, which helped a lot with making it more consistent. Now stacking it increases attack speed, so it's harder to get targets in range, but the targets you do get are worth more. Whether that's a buff or a nerf, I think kind of depends on the distance you're playing at. I do like this item, I think it's pretty well balanced, but it's also an item I find myself scrapping quite a bit. At number 17, Breaching Fin. This item got hit with the full corporate rebrand. New name, new rarity, new mechanics. It went from being called Knockback Fin, a white item with a 7.5% chance to yeet things slightly, to Breaching Fin, a green that launches grounded enemies, stuns them, lets you launch them again mid-air, and gives them a 10% damage vulnerability per launch. It also has a 15-second cooldown now. This is definitely a lot better than it was, but I do think this item still has some issues. As far as being a damage increase, it's pretty underwhelming. The 15-second cooldown is longer than bans and doesn't work on flying enemies. It's an additional 10% on each hit, so if you have 8 stacks, you can theoretically get this to do double damage, but that is a huge investment and it takes a while. The enemies will usually die from your other items before they can get to this point. Yes, it technically double dips on proc chains. If you proc an ATG into a sticky bomb, the damage bonus applies to both, but unless you're swimming in clovers or doing very specific things, this isn't going to affect your gameplay that much. This is more so trivia than something you can actually utilize. Sometimes, in fact, I think this item actually hurts your damage output. The biggest example of this is with Kaijaro's band. If you proc both at the same time, it will knock the enemy away from the band, which is a huge issue for band builds. The best value you can get out of this is actually during boss fights, especially Mithrix, because he's tanky, predictable, and easily bullied, much like Elon Musk. If you stack this item, it can keep him locked in the air, which can be a good tool for keeping him off your back. The damage is just whatever. I actually think the secondary effects are the more compelling part of this item. When this item is procced, it applies a stun. You shoot a guy, stops moving. Not flashy, not rare. This game has like 14 stuns, and this is one of them, but it's a pretty useful one. But the most important thing about Breaching Fin, and the reason I find myself taking it in most games, is because it applies a debuff. That matters, because for a long time, Deathmark builds have been kind of a joke. You needed 4 unique debuffs, and your options were extremely limited. Even on characters that have built-in debuffs like Artie, Rex, or Acrid, there were just not a lot of debuffs going around pre-sots, and it essentially required you to either find a red, an aspect, or a forgive me please with gas to consistently apply Deathmark. And those last two often aren't even worth it because it requires giving up your equipment slot. Breaching Fin is a green that applies a debuff on hit. Yes, it does have a 15-second cooldown, which isn't ideal, but it's less of a problem on Mithrix because he doesn't cleanse it while he's in the air. This, along with another item we'll talk about later, has caused a big ripple effect in the loot pool. Still, I don't recommend stacking it. I think it's fine as a utility piece, keep one for the stun and the debuff, but this is not going to be a very reliable source of damage. Question. Have you ever been so hungry that you started pacing around the house like a Skyrim NPC? You open the fridge, nothing. You open the pantry, nothing. You open the dishwasher just in case. That's when you realize you're not looking for food anymore, you're looking for hope. That's where today's sponsor, Factor, comes in. Factor is the current meta for food consumption in 2025. And look, I've tried the old ways. Grocery shopping, meal prepping, foraging in the woods for berries and moss. All of it pretty mid. But Factor's pretty cracked. They deliver fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted meals straight to your door. No prep, no cleanup, no post-meal spiral into existential dread. Just heat, eat, and try not to cry because the sauce reminds you of your dad. Factor now offers loads of snack options like breakfast, smoothies, juices, small bites, and more to keep me going no matter what's on my schedule. But personally, I'm on that smoothie grind. Tonight I'm having the lemon garlic chicken breast with chive potatoes and roasted veggie medley. And it's genuinely amazing. Go to factor75.com or click the link in the description and use code 50disputed for 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. That's code 50disputed at factor75.com. Half off. That's like almost free. You don't do the math. As always, thank you Factor for supporting the channel. Now back to the video. At number 16, Unstable Transmitter. This is an item that makes me very glad I waited until phase 3 to make this video because we're on version 3 now, maybe 4 if you count the psychological toll. On launch, dropping below 25% health would make you explode for 350% damage and teleport to a random location with a 2-minute cooldown. This was widely regarded as a cry for help. It would regularly teleport you into the center of a void sea, the side of a cliff, or occasionally straight into fall damage. It was less of an item and more of a reminder that you should have scrapped it. Phase 1 rework, massive upgrade, gives you a 75 max health barrier when at low health, saves watches, and repels enemies with a bleeding aura. And most importantly, it had built-in one-shot protection. Even if you are at half HP, you could take 1,000,000 damage and still be fine. It was basically like having a Dio's best friend on a 45-second cooldown. Back then, I would have ranked it top 2, maybe even number 1, but then phase 2 dropped, and with it, reality. They cut the barrier in half, made it consumable once per stage, and deleted the one-shot protection. These are all very significant nerfs, and now it's essentially just an elixir that can be used once a stage, which is still pretty good, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere as powerful as it was. It's an item that often doesn't see use, but when you need it, it's really good to have. Pro tip, if you have more than one and want to scrap the rest, just consume the first one and get rid of the rest of them. After that, the consumed one will be back in your inventory on the next stage. Easy. Number 15. Growth Nectar. The last thing you want in your late game inventory is a nerfed buff scaling item, but as it turns out, that might be what you get. Okay, I'm gonna stop doing that. I profusely apologize. Originally, this gave you a 20% stat boost for 5 seconds if you had 5 buffs. Then, phase 1 made it a permanent 7% boost per buff, capped at 4 for a max of a 28% stat boost. Then, phase 2 came in and, as with most phase 2 changes, gently dropped it down a flight of stairs. Now it's 4% per buff, still capped at 4 for a total of 16%. Getting 4 buffs is not hard to achieve. There's a ton of items that do it, especially now. In fact, all 4 of the DLC 2 common items apply a buff in some way that's pretty easy to get, and even if you don't get the 4, you will still see the value from the buffs you do have. When you stack this item, it increases the cap to 8, and that's quite a bit harder to do. Some survivors have built-in buffs that make this easier, but generally this is not a great one to stack unless you already have the buffs. Now the issue with this item is how it actually works, because it's a bit deceiving. It doesn't give you a flat stat increase like most items. Instead, it multiplies the stats you already have, and that's a really big distinction. Let's say you have 1% crit. With full growth nectar, you would expect that to jump to 17%, right? Well, no, it's actually 1.16, increasing it by less than 1/5 of a percentage point. Even if you've got 50% crit, this turns it into 58%, which is better, but still worse than a single Lensmaker glasses. Pretty abysmal value for a red. And this is kind of the case with all the stats. You already need to have a lot in order to get this item to work well. With the base stats, 16% movement speed is about the same as a hoof, 16% attack speed is about the same as a syringe, but say you already have 5 syringes, a 16% boost is worth about 2 syringes. Pretty cool, I guess. For movement speed, this is largely the same, except there's a bug in the game where it doesn't actually affect move speed, just acceleration. This creates kind of a slippery effect, which feels very weird on everyone except Multi and Artie, whose acceleration stat is already low. This makes them feel a lot better. I assume this is unintentional though, and will be fixed at some point. Essentially, what you're looking at most of the time with this item is 1 Lensmaker, if you're lucky, 2 to 5 Mocha, an Infusion, and a Delicate Watch. That's not to say that's what you'll always get. There are things that can increase its value further, like Tonic, Prayer Beads, Pearls, Radiant Pearls. The max health multiplier in particular can be pretty crazy. It's worth hundreds of health, which is amazing on False Sun. But on everyone else, max HP just isn't all that important of a stat. The damage multiplier is probably the best part of this item, even though it's not even as effective as one watch. At the end of the day, it's an additional damage multiplier, which is always good. The more damage diversity, the better, increases the value of watches and every other damage item in your run. But unless you're playing False Sun, this is far from being a run-defining item and more of a nice stat boost. Real quick, if you're enjoying this video, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps the channel, and according to my grandson, it might make me normal again, whatever that means. Number 14, War Bonds, probably the most memed item on launch. All it did was give you 75 gold a stage, and half the time it didn't even work. So yeah, we were dealing with some real hard hitters. It didn't quite dethrone Aegis as the emperor of useless red items, but it was definitely a part of the court. The Phase 1 rework made this item fire up to 20 missiles during boss events, with each missile doing 2.5% of the enemy's health bar. The first 5 missiles are free, but the next 15 are obtained through collecting gold. For every 2 chests worth of gold you've collected, you'll fire an additional missile. It's worth noting this gold isn't actually consumed, and it's just based off the total gold collected that stage, so don't worry about spending it. If you full loot, this is something that will just happen naturally as you play. For teleporter events, this is a nice damage boost, but as far as reds go, it's fine. There are much better reds in the game, but there's also a lot of worse ones. It at least does something to Mithrix, which is more than you can say for a lot of them. Unfortunately, Warbonds doesn't scale with ICBM, which I think is tragic. ICBM says it boosts all missiles. All missiles. It even boosts the weird harpoons the NG gets. But not this? Alright. I don't really have a ton to say about this one. It's fine. It's not a red I ever find myself seeking out, but if I do find one, I'm happy to see it. At 13, Warped Echo. On launch, this gave you a bubble shield where once hit, 50% of the damage is dealt immediately, while the other 50% is delayed for 3 seconds. Now, this item reduces the next source of damage by 20% and spreads it into 3 hits. All Echo damage is non-lethal except for the final hit, recharges every 15 seconds. Not too big of a change, it's a solid common. I did bump this one down a few spots last minute because the most recent patch did it a little dirty, but we'll get to that. Warped Echo has always had good synergies with items that work on taking damage. Razor Wire procs multiple times, Planula heals you more than it probably should. Repulsion Armor can reduce all 3 hits of the split, and Tougher Times actually gets several chances to block now, which is pretty crazy. It's almost like a clover for the bear. Now, I originally put this a lot higher because, like Phase 1 Transmitter, it had built-in one-shot protection. As long as you were above 50% health, no single hit could kill you when this was up. Race made an excellent video a few months back explaining this. I'll leave a link in the description. But then the last patch happened. They removed the one-shot protection, and worse, they made it interfere with normal one-shot protection. So now, if you're at 91% health and get chunked, Echo can proc first, and the full hit will punch through anyway. Cool. Gotta love that. On the upside, they did change how it interacts with Curse in Eclipse 8. Echo now blocks all Curse damage while it's active, which is amazing if you're playing on higher difficulties, but compared to built-in one-shot protection, I feel like it's kind of like losing your car and being handed a really nice bicycle. As for stacking, it's fine, not incredible. The cooldown doesn't start until all 3 echoes are done triggering, so stacking it can actually delay the recharge. Razor Wire builds are the one exception. If you're going for that, stacking echo is amazing. Otherwise, I think 1 is usually enough. Still, even with the changes, it's a solid pickup, it's reliable, synergizes well, and occasionally saves your life. Just don't rely on it to do what it used to do. That echo's gone. Future disputed here. So after playing with the new Warped Echo a bit more, my opinion has changed. The Curse negation in Eclipse 8 is way stronger than I gave it credit for. It really does feel like a white safer spaces in that mode. I'm still leaving it here because that's something that only affects Eclipse 8, and I feel like this will probably get reverted at some point in the near future. I don't think this was an intended change. But yeah, this is a very busted item. Number 12, Seed of Life. This one is unchanged from launch. This is a passive equipment that will revive you when you die, or in multiplayer can be activated to revive a teammate. It can only do this once, and is then transformed into Seed of Life Consumed, which honestly isn't bad. It spawns a little healing orb on the ground, But the real power of this equipment is its cooldown. Excluding Executive card, it is currently tied with Wood Sprite and Effigy for lowest cooldown in the game with a 15-second cooldown. There are a few items that work on equipment activation, namely Warhorn and Bottled Chaos. It can be particularly useful with Bottled Chaos in multiplayer because Seed of Life is actually a rollable equipment, so if you just keep spamming your equipment, you can actually have infinite revives. It's pretty broken. In multiplayer, I really like this equipment. In single player, it's okay. It's an extra life that takes your equipment slot. It's worth it sometimes, but often builds really rely on specific equipment. If you have bands with capacitor, you're obviously not going to want to trade it. It's one of those items that's only good if you need it. If you never die, it's just taking up space. So yeah, that's kind of all I've got to say about this one. Number 11, Prayer Beads. Grows by gaining experience, storing 20% bonus stats. On removal, gain all stored stats. This one hasn't changed much since launch, aside from minor visual polish. Phase 1 gave it a little animation when you scrap it, which is a nice touch. You get to see your stats inflate in real time, a brief dopamine hit for anyone whose self-worth is directly tied to numbers going up. Now, there was a pretty major bug where it wasn't giving you as much value as it was supposed to. That has been fixed now, and it is fully functional. Mostly. The actual value you get from it is kind of the tricky part. Prayer beads scale off experience, and based on my testing, you can usually expect it to lag about 2 behind your level. So if you're level 14, beads will be around level 12. If you're level 20, they'll be around level 18. To translate that into something more useful, you can usually expect about a 10 to 15% boost to your core stats at the time you scrap it. And that's the catch. You don't get any benefit while it's equipped. The moment of power comes when you remove it, which means Scrapper RNG can really determine if this item is good or not. There is some pretty cool stuff with this item. If you stack prayer beads, they do scale, but they scale poorly. You're better off keeping each copy separate and scrapping them one by one. You get about 50% more value that way, so if you already have one and another drops on a stage with a scrapper, don't pick it up, let it marinate, scrap the first one, and come back to it. Early game, you don't get as much value, so you can hold on to them for a bit, but if you're on stage 4 or 5 and still holding on to this thing without a scrapper in sight, you're playing hot potato with value. Yes, you can still get Mithrix to take it in phase 4 when he yoinks it out of your inventory, but by that point, the run is basically over. That stat boost might help you win slightly harder. This is an item I'm a pretty big fan of now. Initially, I thought the idea of an item that gave you effects when removed from your inventory was stupid, but I've come around on it. There is no other item that does anything remotely similar. Rest in peace, Prayer Bead Printer, by the way. Found one on day 1, wasn't sure how it worked, and then Dan got it removed from the game. Thanks, Dan. Number 10, Chronic Expansion. Killing an enemy increases your damage by 3.5% up to 10 kills for 7 seconds. Dealing damage refreshes the timer. Despite sounding like the name of a CBD startup, Chronic Expansion is one of the strongest damage items we've ever seen. It gives you a permanent scaling damage boost just for doing the one thing the game is built around, killing stuff. You don't need to build around it, you don't need to proc chain it, you just need to exist in a combat encounter. Once you get it going, it stays up. 7 seconds sounds short until you remember how many times a second you hit stuff. If you can't refresh this, you've either left combat or everything on the map is already dead. It does incentivize you to take out smaller threats first, which can change the flow of battle a little bit, but it's usually what you would want to be doing anyway. Now, let's talk numbers. Even with a single copy, once you hit the 10 kill cap, that's a 35% universal damage boost. That's better than a lot of red items. And this is an item that stacks incredibly well. Shocking, I know. Most of the DLC 2 items don't, but this one is very much an exception to that. For 1, it's a 35% increase. For 2, it's a 68% increase. And for 3, it's a 110% increase. Already double damage. Of course, this is the max value you can get, which gets progressively harder to achieve as it requires more kills. But even when it's not maxed out, stacking it increases the value of every individual buff, so you will still see some increase no matter what. Getting the kills in the first place is the hardest thing with this item, but maintaining the damage is pretty easy. Now, it does work better on some characters than others. I found that Loader in particular can struggle a bit because her movement is less about dodging and more about relocating to a new time zone. But for anyone with decent uptime like Commando, Huntress, Bandit, pretty much anybody else, to be honest, this item just melts. It synergizes well with Forgive Me Please and Soulbound Catalyst. In fact, if you have both and find a Chronic Expansion printer, congratulations, you now have the single most cracked build in the entire game. 10 stacks will give you a nearly 7x damage multiplier, which I don't even think is legal in most states. Without an FMP, it kind of sucks on Mithrix Phase 1, but starting in Phase 2, you can begin stacking buffs, and by Phase 3, it's a permanent steroid. This is one of the few items that gets better the longer you survive. It's just raw, unfiltered power creep, and I love it. 10 out of 10 item, would let it date my niece. Number 9, Elusive Antler. Spawns orbs of energy every 10 seconds, giving plus 12% movement speed, up to 3. Another item that was reworked completely from launch. New name, new rarity, new effect, new everything. The less said about the old version, the better. It didn't work, it didn't matter, and nobody misses it. Well, almost nobody. This version though, genuinely good. Movement speed is arguably the most important stat in the entire game, especially if you're new. You move faster, you can dodge more, you'll take less damage, you need less healing, and you'll just live a lot longer. Antler offers more raw movement speed than any other common, the catch being you have to actually grab the orbs, and in combat that's harder than you think. Looting phase, easy, you can basically keep it up forever, but during a boss fight with 15 beetle guards, 2 gups, and your GPU crying, good luck tracking orb spawn patterns. It's a bit of a skill check, which makes it more rewarding, but also more prone to downtime if you're not paying attention. That's why you don't want this to be your only speed item. Don't build your entire speed economy on hopes and dreams. I still recommend supplementing this with hooves and drinks, but it is a really, really good speed item. It's one of the best commons in the game, just a solid, honest movement speed item, something Uncle Benny would call a real orbsman's orb. Whatever that means. At number 8, Long-Standing Solitude. On level up, gain a free unlock for the next purchase, but all gold is converted to experience, and anything that costs gold is increased by 50%. Now look, I've done this item dirty. In my worst items video, I called it the worst. In my best items video, I put it at number 4. So yeah, I've been a little inconsistent, but in my defense, so is this item. This thing is Whiplash Incarnate. Some runs, it's cracked and you feel like you're gaming the system. Other runs, it can really be a hindrance. The key here is economy items. Roll of Pennies, Gore's Tome, and Brittle Crown. These are your lifeline. With even one of them, Solitude becomes way more manageable. You're racking up levels faster than the enemies can scale, and each one gives you another free item. You're basically bypassing the gold economy entirely. But if you don't have any econ items, this can seriously cripple your run, at least in the short term. You can find yourself in a position where you're just not leveling fast enough to outpace the enemies, and this can spiral out of control fast. If you can't kill the enemies, you can't level up, which means you can't get loot either, and then you don't really have a way to get stronger, so over time that problem will just magnify. Definitely do not take this one blind. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it's horrible. So I figured somewhere around the middle should be right. This is the conclusion I've come to, but keep in mind, I don't use Lunars very often, so take my opinion on this one with a grain of salt. I've been wrong about it before, so it's possible I'm not giving it enough credit, or too much credit. Number 7, Chance Stall. Gain 40% chance to increase item rarity at Shrines of Chance. It might be surprising to see this item so high up on the list, but it's one that has a major effect on your run. Just one of these makes it more common to see greens from a chance shrine than whites, and it takes the odds of finding a red from under 1% to almost 5%. Each shrine has 2 items, so that makes the odds of finding a red in any given shrine about 9%. And that's just with one. I have found this item doesn't stack incredibly well. An additional 10% upgrade chance just isn't that much of an increase. 2 takes the red chance from 5% to 6%, which is hardly noticeable. I will usually try to have only one. If I find another one on the ground, I'll usually scrap the first one, unless it's stage 5, in which case I'm gonna scrap both before Mithrix anyway. Where this item really shines is synergy, specifically with Clover. The doll is affected by luck, so when Clover enters the equation, you start seeing consistent shrine upgrades. At that point, I actually like having 2 or even 3. The value scales better because your odds are already boosted. This item has actually changed how I play the game. I now avoid chance shrines until the end of a stage, just in case I find a chance doll or a Clover. That's how good it is. Like any green economy item, the earlier the better. Finding this on stage 5 isn't going to move the needle, but stage 1, that can snowball you into a much stronger build. And you've got a decent shot at finding it early since greens are everywhere, and Halcyon Shrine prefers DLC 2 items. Chance shrines are pretty common. There's usually at least one on each stage, probably more, and being able to get more greens and reds just gives your run a lot more potential. And yes, you can get yellow items. It's incredibly rare and has only happened to me once since launch, but it is possible. At number 6, Luminous Shot. Activating secondary skill stores up to 5 charges, requires 3 charges of your primary skill to fire lightning strikes, dealing 175% total damage. It also reduces your secondary skill cooldown by 20%. This is one of those items that doesn't look that strong at first glance, and then you actually play with it, and suddenly it's shredding everything on screen. Luminous Shot is kind of weird. It's technically a proc item, but it's tied to your ability rhythm, not your attack speed. It doesn't trigger on hit or on crit or on some random roll. It rewards you just for using your secondary regularly, which, spoiler alert, you should already be doing. There's no upkeep, no timing, no special setup. You just use your secondary when it's up, and this item takes care of the rest. Every 3 or 4 rotations, you'll just get a lightning storm on top of your base damage. Now, you can min-max it a little. You can fire your secondary out of combat to bank charges ahead of time and then unleash all 5 on a boss, and that's cool, but you don't really need to. The passive value is already high enough that most of the time it's just on. That rhythm of building up charges and dropping lightning feels natural, like you're just being rewarded for playing the game properly. There is a bit of variance in its usefulness across the cast. The first survivor that comes to mind is False Sun. This item is absolutely busted on him. It can proc off your slam attack, which is 1000% damage, so it just absolutely melts. The higher the primary damage, the better this is, so great on rebar puncher, not so great on nail gun. But even on the survivors with low damage primaries, it's still a lot of free damage and procs, as well as a 20% faster cooldown, which is just universally great and combos very well with backup mags. As far as stacking it, it's a little weird. Going from 175 damage to 225 is great, but adding an additional charge often doesn't do very much because in order to get the higher stacks, you have to stop using your primary. So I generally don't like to stack this unless I find a printer and I'm really building around it. Otherwise, I feel like 1 is enough. I think about this item like a budget charge perforator. It doesn't hit as hard, but it hits about as often and is not a huge pain in the ass to get. At number 5, Electric Boomerang. 15% chance on hit to fire an electric boomerang that slices through enemies, dealing 120 base damage, and deals an additional 120% base damage per second and stuns all enemies hit. Can strike enemies on the way back. Yeah, it's a red item. And somehow, this is still one of the most overlooked reds in the game. Like, people will happily grab a pocket ICBM even if they have 0 missiles, but this is doing all of the work of a ukulele, shuriken, and multiple stun grenades, and no one even talks about it. That 120% might not look like much at first, but then you realize it hits multiple times, like a lot of times. Between the initial slice, the return arc, and any extra bounces you sneak in by lining things up, this can easily end up dealing well over 500% total damage on a good trigger, and it can do that to multiple enemies at a time while stunning all of them. And not in a way that just interrupts their attacks, it will actually stun them. This thing will lock enemies down. It turns a golem into a blinking light show and makes overloading Elder Lemurians feel like you just press pause. Especially if you're playing on someone with higher attack speed, or better yet, multiple sources of attack, like Nailgun Multi or Engineer's Turrets, you start chaining procs, and you've basically installed crowd control on your left click. It's also a really good procer. It has a 1.0 proc coefficient, and it hits multiple times, so it's great for ATGs, bleed, and just any proc chain in general. If you're playing a survivor that leans into on-hit effects, this thing is going to carry a lot of your mid-game. Commando, Bandit, Captain, Nailgun Multi, all perfect users. That said, it's not perfect. This isn't the best red on everyone. Slower characters like Loader, Railgunner, Artificer, they struggle a bit with the low proc rate, and they don't really need the stun since they're already nuking things. Huntress is a little awkward too. You're usually auto-aiming in the opposite direction of the crowd, so unless you're manually dragging your camera every shot, you might not even notice this even firing. On everyone else though, this item is absurdly good. If the item had a longer cooldown and a cooler name like Lightning Guillotine, more people would be calling it broken, but instead, it's just a boomerang, an electric one. Number 4, Noxious Thorn. Gain 10% chance to bleed an enemy. On killing an enemy, transfer 33% of every debuff stack to one enemy within 20 meters. This item has a weird name, a weird effect, and a weird amount of value packed into it. Noxious Thorn is one of those items that doesn't really tell you how strong it is, it just quietly breaks entire archetypes when you actually start playing with it. The bleed is pretty standard, 10% on hit, not the selling point, but this alone has a pretty big effect on the pool at large. It does a couple things. 1, makes bleed more common. 2, allows you to have both bleed and prolapse from needle tick at the same time. This is something that was previously only possible with crit and shatter spleen. Why is this important? Well, like with Breaching Fin, it makes it a lot easier to get Deathmark up. And that's just with the bleed. We haven't even gotten to the second part, the debuff transfer, where suddenly this thing becomes a core engine for a bunch of status-based builds. Here's what it does. Every time you kill an enemy, you take 1/3 of all debuff stacks on that enemy, send them over to another one nearby. If you stack the item, it bounces to additional targets. And this includes every debuff, not just bleed, not just slow. We're talking burns, poison, prolapse, deathmark, anything that counts as a debuff. This means Noxious Thorn essentially recycles your damage. You dump your procs into one target, it dies, and the effect spreads to another. That one dies, spread it again. It creates this cascade where your status effects just keep moving through a crowd. It is one of the most satisfying things in the game. It's especially strong with on-kill builds, debuff stacking, or anything where you're already applying a lot of debuffs very quickly. Stuff like Gasoline, Tri-Tips, even Fragile Armor from Shattering Justice, they all benefit from Thorn. And if you're running Deathmark, this is borderline essential. Not only does the bleed make proccing it more reliable, but being able to spread Deathmark to other enemies is absurdly powerful. It's also incredible for characters that rely on high status uptime, Commando, Acrid, even Artificer. Anyone who's hitting multiple targets or building a lot of on-hit status effects gets huge value out of this, and it helps your AoE in clear ways that most items don't. You don't just kill a guy, you kill a guy and hand off all its pain to the next guy. The range is also deceptively good, 20 meters baseline, and it scales fast with stacks. You can clear an entire wave just by killing one key enemy, and the rest of the room gets tagged before they even notice. Is it great on every survivor? Not really. Some burst-heavy characters don't get much value out of it, and characters like Loader or Railgunner aren't applying a ton of debuffs to begin with. Not useless though, it does still help with stuff like gas. This is one of the strongest greens in the game. It feels more like a red than it does a green, to be honest. Very, very strong item. At number 3, Runic Lens. 3% chance on hit to call a meteor strike, dealing 2000% base damage. Every 100% attack damage dealt increases the activation chance by 3% and damage by 150%. This is one of those items that was put in the game to test if anyone was paying attention. Because at first glance, 3% chance on hit doesn't sound like a top 3 item. That's lower than ATG, lower than Sticky Bomb, and lower than the average YouTube commenter's reading comprehension. But then you read the rest of the effect and see it in action, and wonder why everything on screen just exploded. Everything I said the first time I ranked this item still holds up, except for the part about needing more visual effects. They actually did that. The tooltip got reworded to be clearer. The numbers are mostly the same. I think it got a slight nerf to the proc chance, but overall, it's still ridiculous. Now here's where it gets kind of dumb. Runic Lens can't proc itself, but it can proc an ATG, and that ATG can then go on to proc another Runic Lens, and that can proc another ATG, which can proc another Runic Lens, and so on. This creates what is effectively an infinite proc chain. The chances of it actually going infinite are incredibly low, but the chances of it happening once or twice in a chain is definitely feasible, especially if you throw in other proc items with Clover. There is no other item that behaves like this. Normally procs are a one and done, you don't get ATGs off ATGs, but Runic Lens reopens the loop. I have to assume this isn't intentional, but it's been around long enough now that it might just be one of those bugs that graduated to a feature. Even without the chain reaction nonsense, it's still a top tier damage item. 2000% base damage is 2/3 of a royal capacitor, and this is on hit. This is especially nasty on burst damage survivors like Loader or Railgunner, since their big hits increase the activation chance, but it's also great on proc heavy survivors, Commando, Bandit, Huntress, because even though their individual hits are weaker, they make up for it with frequency. It's also excellent AoE. The meteor has a huge blast radius and hits hard enough to wipe groups. If you find this early on, you're gonna have a good run. That's not a maybe, that's just how it works. I tried explaining proc chains to Uncle Benny. He shook his head and said, I don't chain things, I release them. Coming in at the number 2 spot, we have Sailar. Gain an extra item on the first chest open once per stage. That's it, that's the whole item, and it turns out that's all it needs. Sailar is one of the most powerful items in the game because it doesn't give you a stat buff, or a proc effect, or a flashy explosion. It gives you more of everything else. Every stage, first chest you open, you get 2 items instead of 1. And that's a massive advantage. You don't need to kill more enemies, you don't need to save up extra gold, you don't need a specific equipment or item combo, you just need to open 1 chest. And once you do so, that's 1 extra item per stage guaranteed for the rest of the run. That adds up fast. By stage 5 or 6, you've got 5 or 6 extra items, just because you had this in your inventory. That's more value than a lot of green items give, and you don't even have to think about it. It's also build agnostic. It doesn't matter if you're playing a proc build, a bleed build, you're playing railgunner, commando, it works on everybody. It doesn't matter if you're rushing, full looting, you'll always want more items. It's not even a decision. Now, to be fair, there are some slight downsides. You have to remember to actually open the right chest. If you accidentally open a small chest, that's your sale star trigger. Let's be honest, everyone has done this at least once, but I would chalk this up to user error more than anything. And believe me, I have definitely done my fair share of user erroring. Very often this item translates into at least one free red from the legendary chest on stage 4, except on Sirens. God, I hate that map. Big chests also give you an additional 20% shot at a red. You can get even more value out of it with a recycler. Getting 2 reds and being able to reroll both of them is a very strong strat. And like Chance Stall, this is another item that has completely altered how I clear stages. Now I will always try to leave a big chest until the end, just in case I find one that stage. At the end of the day, more items equals more power, which equals better runs. And this is one of the easiest ways to get them. This was almost number 1, but the top spot does a very similar thing, and you guys probably already know what it is. Coming in at the number 1 spot, Sonorous Whispers. When a large monster is killed, it will always drop an item. All elites have a 4% chance to drop an item. That's it, that's the item, and it completely redefines the flow of a run. Sonorous Whispers isn't exciting on paper, it doesn't boost your stats, it doesn't fire lasers or trigger some huge AoE explosion. What it does instead is far more dangerous. It guarantees loot, and not just sometimes. Every large monster and every boss is a guaranteed drop. On top of that, it adds a 4% drop chance to every elite, which sounds low, and early on, it is, but by stage 4 or 5, it's not unusual to be fighting 20 to 30 elites per map. That's 1 or 2 extra items minimum just for staying alive. If you loop, it gets even crazier, and yes, the 4% drop chance is affected by luck. So once again, Clover breaks everything. The key here is that the reward isn't tied to gold, or timing, or routing, it's tied to combat. You get paid just for fighting. The more enemies you kill, the more your build snowballs, and unlike Sale Star, there's no cap, no cooldown, no once per stage clause, just consistent, exponential item generation doing what you're already doing. And like I talked about last time, this can absolutely be abused. They finally patched Void Fields so time advances now, meaning no more free infinite scaling there, but Prime Meridian and Gilded Coast still don't, and Gilded Coast has always been the better abuse case anyway. So grab a Whispers, dream of wealth, and you'll be harvesting items like you're running a factory. This was nerfed a bit from the first time we talked about it. It used to be an 80% chance for a white, 20 for a green, and 0.1 for a red. Now it's 90% white, 10% green, and still 0.1 for a red. That's really low. I was a little sad to see this change, but it's still incredibly broken and is one of the biggest run-defining items. Whenever I see this in a soup early on, unless I'm struggling or I have really, really good greens, I'll pretty much always trade it. By the end of the run, it will usually have paid for itself and then some. Anyway, that's going to do it for this list. What'd you guys think? This was a really difficult one. Usually I try to avoid ranking items of different rarities. It's already hard enough to compare them within the same tier, let alone comparing a white to a red to a lunar to an equipment. You very rarely, if ever, have the opportunity to choose between these items in this way. At least with items in the same tier, you're swapping between them, scrapping, printing. But for a list like this, it's entirely theoretical, so I hope I did an alright job. Also, huge shout out to Lena, formerly Kami, on this one. This video is double the length of my usual lists, and I would be lost without her help. Also, big shout out to my members for supporting the channel. I know I've been teasing this one for a while, so thank you guys for being patient with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.